everyone. Meteorologist Ben Dorenbach here live just about midnight or a few minutes after. Burning the midnight oil, as they say, as we continue to track. Now major once again Hurricane Dorian. Now, just because it's major doesn't mean that there have been any major changes. It just so happened that the wind at the center rose 5 miles per hour. Went up from 110 to 115. The threshold from Category 3 to 2 is 111 miles per hour. So just one of those formalities, which, again, yes, technically it's major, but in terms of South Carolina coastal impacts, no major changes. So we can definitely relax on that upgrade, but still expecting impacts along the coast. So let's get the latest on information as far as Dorian is concerned. Winds at the center at 115, still moving straight north at about 7 miles per hour, and eventually we're expecting it to take that northeasterly turn. It's still about 80 miles away from the center of the storm from Charleston, so that's where we see some of the heaviest rain bands that are moving in from the east, so we're going to see some upticks in rain rates here over the next few minutes. Luckily, based on this, we're looking a little bit drier farther east. It looks like a lot of these rain bands are coming in from the straight east, so we might be able to catch a break in some of those rain bands, those tropical rain bands. But just to give you an idea of some of the rain rates associated with it, approaching about 1 inch per hour, which fortunately out on the coast, our threshold for flash flooding is pretty high, around 2 to 3 inches per hour. And those rates are certainly possible over the next few hours. So basically, from tonight into the morning tomorrow, conditions are going to really get noisy, both in terms of the rain and the wind in Charleston. But before I get to that, I just want to recap the new tracks. So we've got minimal Category 3 hurricane that's going to continue moving straight north for another few hours, and then once we hit the early morning hours tomorrow, it'll still be hanging on by a string to Category 3 strength. Notice it's going to be about 30-40 miles from the Charleston coast at that point, but it's at that point or close to it when we're expecting for it to take more of a northeasterly turn, move into cooler water, and become a Category 2. But regardless, we're still expecting about the same type of impacts for the South Carolina coast. And by Thursday evening, tomorrow evening, this will be moving out of South Carolina and into North Carolina and eventually possibly making landfall in North Carolina. Landfall is still not out of the question along the South Carolina coast, but that's looking more and more likely now over the North Carolina coast. So as we track the circulation, notice that this thing is moving from Charleston into Myrtle Beach by about 7 o'clock tomorrow. And at that point, we're going to see rain and wind be the main issues. So if we take a look at the futurecast wind gusts, fast forwarding from about now till about noon, 1 o'clock, you see these highest wind gusts around 62 miles per hour in Charleston. They could very well be a little bit higher, but that should give you a good idea of when conditions will be worst in terms of both rain and wind in Charleston. So we're talking about morning to early afternoon in Charleston, and then if we fast forward toward about 6, 7 p.m., that transitions a little bit farther north toward Myrtle Beach. So it's pretty much the afternoon and evening in Myrtle Beach and the morning and early afternoon in Charleston. And that's also going to coincide pretty well with the rain and, of course, the wind, too. Speaking of wind, let's take a look at some of the current observations along the coast. Still not seeing any tropical storm force winds or anything like that. So we still wait for that, but in the meantime, we're still expecting some high rain totals from about 6 to 10 inches from Charleston up to Wilmington, and that's going to combine with some storm surge as well. In fact, we have storm surge warnings in effect all along the coast, and that could mean 5 to 8 foot surf, and that could result in some coastal and possibly inland flooding. We have to note that high tide is happening within about the next hour. So the timing is certainly not ideal, but I will say this: if high tide were happening at about, say, 9, 10, 11 a.m., it would be a lot worse, because that's when we're going to see the center of the storm probably approach Charleston a lot closer. So I'll say this, it could be worse, but still having a high tide at that time, kind of like what we had with Hurricane Matthew. It was one of those, like, yes, it was a bad situation, but I suppose it could have been worse. But regardless, still be prepared for possible flooding association with Hurricane Dorian. So again, it's going to be over the next few hours, overnight into the morning, when conditions really deteriorate in Charleston, and then later in the day tomorrow across Myrtle Beach. So in a nutshell, here's what we're expecting for the coast, not the upstate. 40 to 60 mile per hour winds with some higher gusts near hurricane force. Heavy rain with 4 to 8 inches likely on average. Again, some areas could very well see 6 to 10, and that's in conjunction with 5 to 8 foot surge with inland impacts as well. So if that center of the storm tracks a little bit closer to the coast, That's going to result in some higher inland impacts in the form of river flooding and possibly even flash flooding. So right now it's looking like most of the models are keeping the center of the storm a little bit off the coast by about 30 miles. So I'll show you that right here, in that most of these lines, indicative of a separate computer model, pretty consistent in keeping the center of Dorian just a few miles, 20 to 40 miles off the coast the entire time, and having a better shot at landfall in North Carolina. So that should keep most of the worst of the impacts both on the coast and a little bit into several miles inland along the PD and other regions that have rivers that tend to flood, kind of like what we saw with Florence last year and Matthew a few years ago. So that's what we're expecting along the coast in terms of local impacts here in the western Carolinas. Nutshell, little to no impacts. Breezier weather, cloudier weather, gusts up to 25 miles per hour. A stray shower certainly possible with some of the wraparound moisture. As you can see, the storm is quite big, but as you can see, the majority of that is sticking around Charleston. So you can see a very defined center. And again, rain rates are going to be approaching about 1 inch per hour east of Charleston. They're going to be moving in. So that's going to continue for several hours during the overnight hours and into the morning tomorrow. So Charleston overnight tonight through the early afternoon tomorrow. That is going to be your timeline of the worst conditions for flooding, storm surge, and of course high winds up to 74 miles per hour. Myrtle Beach, it's going to be a little bit later for you. We're talking afternoon into the evening. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell for you. After that, we should be all done with Dorian, pending no major damage or flooding. We'll hope for the best on that. We'll let you know if that's the case, but in the meantime, we'll keep you updated throughout the night and the rest of the day tomorrow.